Palmyra, a tropical island in the South Seas. For most of the year, it's uninhabited. But by strange coincidence, in June of 1974, 6 sailboats all converged on this tiny island. It should have been Shangri-La, but when bad blood developed, piracy took over, and the only law was the law of the jungle.
A small, uninhabited island almost 1,000 miles from nowhere. It's hard to believe such a paradise really exists. For most sailors on the South Pacific, Palmyra is a stop on the way to somewhere else. But for a few, it's a destination of its own, a place to disappear from the world. That's just what happened to Mac and Muff Graham, although it wasn't their intention. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. Crime on the high seas falls under the jurisdiction of the FBI. The disappearance of the Grahams and their yacht suggested trouble in paradise. The problem was, there was not a shred of evidence to prove it.
Palmyra Atoll is a series of small islands in the South Pacific, formed by a coral reef which surrounds a lagoon. It is owned by the United States, and during World War II, it housed a U.S. Navy base. The remains of the deserted base are still on the island today. It is located approximately 1,000 miles from Hawaii and is a stopover point for sailors and yachtsmen on their way to Samoa. Oftentimes, large, beautiful sailboats can be seen at the broken-down docks in its lagoon. But on June 26, 1974, a small sailboat named the Iola made its way past the docks and into Palmyra's makeshift harbor. She had just completed a difficult 19-day journey from Hawaii, carrying a crew of 2. The boat was not suitable for the trip, and now limped into the lagoon, barely seaworthy. The ship's motor had frozen up about halfway to Palmyra. Before leaving Hawaii, the owners had repaired the Iola, which was a wooden boat, by covering it with a coat of fiberglass. The friction created by these 2 materials caused a crack to form in the hull. On the way to Palmyra, the Iola had begun to take on water. They had little money and very few provisions. Their plan was to live off the fruits of the island until later in the year. They had made a deal with some friends to bring supplies to the island, which they would exchange for a crop of marijuana they intended to grow. When they arrived at Palmyra, they were unhappy to see a handful of visitors at the dock area. They had hoped they would have the island to themselves. When they came ashore, they were greeted by a welcoming committee. It wasn't at all what they had expected. They introduced themselves as Stephanie Stearns and Roy Allen, even though the name Buck was tattooed on his right arm in plain view.
What's your name, I'm sorry? Roy Allen. Roy? Yeah. Roy, you got Buck on your the side there.
When one of the yachtsmen commented on it, Stephanie claimed that Buck was his nickname. Something about Roy was different from the other yachters. He seemed rougher, perhaps even a little dangerous. Shortly after Roy and Stephanie arrived, another boat appeared in the channel, a beautiful 38-foot ketch called the Sea Wind. It wasn't long before the new arrivals made their way over to the dock. Mac Graham was 53 years old. His wife, Eleanor, nicknamed Muff, was a few years younger.
Hey, I want Mac. This is my wife, Muff.
Muff? Hi, Evelyn.
Like Roy, they were surprised to find so many people on what was supposed to be an uninhabited island where they planned to spend the better part of a year.
Hi, Stephanie. I'm Mac. Yeah? Hey, Mac, you got any cigarettes? Sure.
When Roy noticed Mac was a smoker, he asked for a cigarette and took most of the pack. This gesture would be considered impolite anywhere, but on an island, it was particularly so as supplies are limited and can't easily be replaced. For Mac and the others, this was their first insight into the kind of person Roy Allen might be. Roy also boasted about his plans to raise marijuana and trade it for supplies. Soon, everyone began settling into their new life in paradise. Mac Graham began to explore the island, the ruins of the Navy base and the sandy shores.
CQ, CQDX.
And he also made sure to keep in touch with the outside world by shortwave radio.
Everything's fine out here.
At regularly scheduled times, Mac would contact his friend Kurt Shoemaker in Hawaii and tell him about his latest discoveries.
Here's KH6IHG, Hawaii Island, calling and listening. He's just like, Tom Sawyer out in the, on the Mississippi or something. And so he would explain what he did each day. He'd go on excursions, just him, with his machete through the jungle and exploring all the things down there.
For Roy and Stephanie, on the other hand, things weren't going quite as well. Roy found the island was not well suited for growing marijuana. Living aboard the Iola was difficult. The boat was small, damp, cluttered, and cramped. Their supplies were all but gone, and they began to barter their possessions with the owners of the other boats for food and supplies. To the Grahams and the others, Roy and Stephanie were a nuisance. They were not properly supplied to be out on the high seas this far from civilization. The other yachters had enough supplies for themselves, with some extra for emergencies, but not enough to supply Roy and Stephanie. The Grahams were known for their hospitality. They had invited the other visitors to Palmyra aboard the Sea Wind. Others warned them not to allow Roy and Stephanie on their boat. But Mac wanted to make an attempt at being cordial. On July 5th, 2 weeks after the Grahams arrived, and long after everyone else on the island had already had the tour of the Sea Wind, Roy and Stephanie received an invitation to visit. They eagerly accepted.
Oh, the Sea Wind was a real yacht. It was a beautiful looking boat to begin with, and nice lines, and Mac had kept it in just perfect shape.
It's gorgeous, huh? That's the
Sea Wind was everything the Iola was not. It had a fully stocked larder, and it was equipped with every high-tech navigational device on the market. It had plenty of room, and the Sea Wind had sailed around the world. Stephanie commented on its size and human comforts. She was enchanted by the big bunk in the forward cabin. Roy remained sullen. When Roy began to find the cramped quarters and damp bedding of the Iola too confining, he decided to move into a makeshift tent on the beach. Stephanie would stay aboard the boat. By now, Roy and Stephanie had bartered most of their possessions with the other yachters for food and supplies. Other than trading or flat-out begging, they had little to do with the others. The situation was getting worse by the day. Most of the marijuana seedlings they had counted on for money had been eaten by insects. Although Palmyra has abundant natural resources, including fish, crabs, bird eggs, and coconuts, Roy had little knowledge of how to survive off the land. To catch fish, he would shoot them with his .22 caliber revolver. Like clockwork, Mac continued his weekly radio conversations with Kurt, and he kept him informed about Roy and Stephanie.
Okay.
It had moved way down the end of the lagoon and would have nothing to do with the other group. And bizarre things like they started planting marijuana again to see if they could grow it. He needed, I think they were running low on food, so he needed coconuts. He took a chainsaw and cut a coconut tree down to get to the coconuts. That's kind of stupid.
It also infuriated Mac Graham. Mac loved the island and had no tolerance for Roy's destructive
What's your
ways.
problem? You don't have to do that to get one of these. Why don't you just climb up and get it down?
One day he confronted Roy about it.
I'd ask you for your
Roy
opinion
quickly
anyway.
became angry and told Mac to mind his own business. The hostility between them was building. On July 13th, Muff Graham wrote her mother a letter. She hadn't been enthusiastic about living on an island in the first place, and having Roy and Stephanie there only added to her misgivings. Dearest Mother, 3 boats are here now, but one is leaving and will take this letter with them. That leaves us alone with the hippie couple who plan to stay here and live off the land. It's just our luck they decided to roost in Palmyra. Roy and Stephanie have run out of sugar, cigarettes, and I don't know what. They've bartered with other boats. Next, they will ask us. Muff sent the letter back to civilization with Bernard and Evelyn Leonard, who were leaving Palmyra after a brief stay. The Grahams had previously made arrangements to receive letters over the radio from Kurt Shoemaker, who read them to Mac during their regular weekly shortwave contacts.
During that period of time, I was receiving mail from both of their mothers, his mother and hers. And then I would read this to them. Well, as one of the boats down there would leave, they would take the mail with them and eventually mail it when back in Honolulu or wherever. So there was communication going back and forth. And an interesting thing about it is one of the letters I read, the mother, and I think she was in her 80s, she says that she was afraid for them. She says, you should leave that place, something will happen to you.
One day when Mac was talking to Kurt, he told him that Roy had sent a message with one of the yachts back to his friends in Hawaii. They were supposed to bring Roy and Stephanie's supplies to Palmyra, and he told his friends to reply through Kurt's shortwave radio. Mac asked him if he had heard any news from them. But Kurt had heard nothing, and when Mac talked to him about Roy and Stephanie, there was something about their description that worried him.
Then in between these conversations, he had occasionally mentioned the other boat. And I told him, I said, you know, that doesn't sound too good to these people. I said, you know, you better be careful. And he said, no, I can take care of myself. I'll be all right. And, so I said, well, I don't know. I think you ought to get out of there myself, or one of you ought to leave.
My fault?
I don't want to hear it.
No, I don't care.
Roy and Stephanie's tempers
I
were
live in a
running
dump,
short.
that's why. Look around you.
During the first weeks of August, the sound of angry voices could frequently be heard across the lagoon. The other visitors to the island saw Roy as a violent and quick-tempered man who was dangerous and should be avoided. Then, midway through August, another boat came to Palmyra and spent a few days. Norman Sanders and Thomas Wolfe were on their way to Samoa. The night before they were set to leave, they had cocktails with Mac and Muff. The talk turned to the Iola. Sanders was a sailing expert. He told them he had offered Roy advice about getting the Iola to Samoa. He said he'd suggested Roy and Stephanie should go there, but Roy had just become angry and refused the help. Wolfe cautioned the Grahams that it would be easy for an unsuspecting couple to disappear on a place like Palmyra. In response, Mac opened a drawer and pulled out a .357 Magnum. He assured the others that he could take care of himself. I'm tougher than he is, Mac said confidently. Wolfe and Sanders left Palmyra the next day.
The group of people that were down there, the various boats, one by one, of course, were on their way somewhere, and they, one after another, left.
Visitors had come and gone pretty regularly for the last 2 months, but with the departure of Wolfe and Sanders on August 17th, things changed. This was the end of the season when most sailors would be stopping by Palmyra. Mac and Muff Graham were alone on the island with Stephanie and Roy. On August 27th, Mac talked to Kurt Shoemaker. Roy and Stephanie and the Grahams had been alone on Palmyra for 10 days. The tension between Mac and Muff Graham and Roy and Stephanie had increased. Muff knew Roy had a gun and a chainsaw, and at one point he'd been seen with an acetylene torch. This scared her and she wanted off Palmyra, but Mac stubbornly didn't want to leave. The boats had moved to opposite sides of the lagoon and the couples pretty much ignored each other. But then, something unusual happened.
Here is KH6IHG. I was talking to him, and while we're talking, he hears a female voice yelling, saying, calling to him. And he says, "Oh, what's this happening?" So he says, "Hang on a minute, I'll go topside and see." And he says, "I'll be darned. She's coming over in her dinghy, and she says she has a cake for him." And he says, "I guess they're going to declare a truce or something, huh?" That was the words he used. He says, "I better check this out carefully." I said, "Okay." So same schedule next week, same time. So I said, "Be careful now. See you later." Was it?
1 week later, Shoemaker was at his radio for their regularly scheduled conversation. For the first time since Mac and Muff had left Hawaii, there was no response from the sea wind.
I was concerned about that, and I tried for quite a while, about 20 minutes to half an hour, trying to make contact. So the next contact was a couple of days later, and then I tried again, nothing. And then for the next few weeks, I tried, intermittently from time to time. And then it was at that point that I decided something happened.
Unable to convince the authorities that something had gone wrong on Palmyra, Shoemaker had a friend fly over the island. The aerial survey seemed to confirm his worst fears. Palmyra was deserted. There were no boats in the harbor, no Iola, no sea wind, and there was no sign of life.
Well, I had a feeling that all that time that something had happened. The boat had been taken over. I was very strong feelings about that, simply because of all of the incidents that they related to me and he related, and I mean it just pointed to that one thing, but I couldn't convince anyone that that was a problem.
Shoemaker did have one resource available to him, the radio. Having no idea where they had gone, he spread the word to yachtsmen in the Pacific to be on the lookout for the sea wind. But days, weeks, and then months passed with no word about the fate of Mac and Muff Graham or the sea wind. 2 months after the last communication with the Grahams, Bernard and Evelyn Leonard, who had been given the last written message from the Grahams, were at the Alawai Yacht Harbor in Hawaii. Bernard noticed a 38-foot ketch with very distinctive lanterns.
Yes, it is. Yes, it
Well,
is.
then it had to be.
It had been repainted, but Bernard was certain it was the sea wind. He also recognized a familiar figure on deck, Roy Allen. Knowing the tensions that had existed between the Grahams and Roy and Stephanie, and also knowing that the Grahams had not been heard from in some time, Leonard immediately called the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard had been aware of the missing sea wind. When Leonard explained that the owners were not on the boat, the Coast Guard officers felt this might lead to something outside of their jurisdiction. They called the FBI. The call was answered by Special Agent Calvin Shishido, who worked out of the FBI's Hawaii field office.
My assignment there was just a general mix of general criminal investigations, security investigations, backgrounds. It was such a small office that we couldn't specialize. We had to handle everything that came at us.
Shishido agreed to meet the Coast Guard and the Leonards at the marina, although what he heard was not conclusive enough to warrant FBI involvement. Perhaps the owners were on shore, or perhaps they had sold the boat. Perhaps it wasn't even the sea wind. After arriving moments later, the Leonards showed him the yacht in question. There seemed to be no one aboard.
So he pointed out the areas where there was an attempt to disguise the boat. You know, it had been repainted, the gunnels had been repainted, the nameplate was taken off, it was removed and painted over. and other things that he pointed out to show that it was actually the sea wind. He knew it was the sea wind.
Although there was still no direct evidence of foul play, Shishido was growing suspicious. There was no visible activity on the boat, so Shishido instructed the Coast Guard officers to post a lookout. The lookout spotted Roy and Stephanie the next morning, rowing from the floating dock towards shore in a little dinghy. He immediately alerted the Coast Guard, who in turn called Special Agent Shishido. But another boat owner hailed Stephanie and Roy and told them that the Coast Guard had been looking around their boat the day before. Roy noticed a Coast Guard patrol boat in the marina that seemed to be moving towards them. Roy quickly changed direction and headed for the nearest dock. After letting Roy off, Stephanie started to row back to the sea ring. Two plainclothes policemen were approaching Roy when he spotted them. Without hesitating, he turned and dove off the end of the dock and began to swim away. The officers found a wallet on the dock.
And in it was the identification of this Roy Allen, and it had a photograph. And I believe Mr. Leonard looked at the picture and said that was Roy Allen.
Meanwhile, the Coast Guard boat had spotted Stephanie in the rowboat and began to give chase. She turned and started to row towards shore, hoping to reach the dock before they caught up with her. When she reached the dock, she jumped out and began to run, but there was nowhere for her to go. The patrol boat was right behind, with Bernard Leonard aboard. He and a Coast Guardsman followed her. They saw her dart into a hotel stairwell. They found her hiding behind a potted palm. She immediately recognized Leonard from Palmyra.
Come with us.
As the Coast Guard officer took her into custody, one question was foremost on Leonard's mind. What had happened to the Grahams? Stephanie Stearns was taken to the Coast Guard offices for questioning. On the way there, Bernard Leonard and Stephanie found themselves alone in the rowboat. When he asked if Mac and Muff were still alive, she shook her head. Mac and Muff, she told him, had apparently drowned. At least, they never found their bodies. Leonard was incredulous. How could that have happened? Stephanie explained that she and Roy had been invited to the Sea Wind for dinner, but the Grahams never showed up. The next morning, she and Roy found the Grahams' overturned inflatable Zodiac boat washed up on shore in the shark-infested lagoon. After searching fruitlessly for the bodies, they decided to take their own boat back to Hawaii, but it got hung up on the reef. So they went back and took the abandoned Sea Wind. Leonard listened to Stephanie, but he didn't believe her story.
As I remember it, I was
In the Coast Guard offices, she started telling her story again, this time to Special Agent Shishido and the Coast Guard.
At any time. Okay,
This is the way it happened. This is the way I'm telling it to you.
details then of what happened to them.
At one point, I remember speaking to her. She kept going on, and I kept reminding her that she had the right to remain silent and that anything she said could be used against her in a court of law. And she would just keep on talking.
Stephanie told him she had arrived at the Seawind with Roy just about in time for dinner. The boat was strangely quiet. They called out, but no one answered.
Hello? Hello? Mac? Mom? Hello?
They went below and continued their search, but got no reply.
I can't find anybody down here.
They're not here.
Didn't you say they were gonna meet us here?
Yeah, they knew we were coming for dinner.
They assumed the Grahams had gone out fishing for dinner and made themselves at home till they returned.
There's nobody here.
According to Stephanie, the Grahams never showed up, so they both decided to spend the night on the Seawind.
All right.
They believed the Grahams would show up any time. But the next morning, when the Grahams hadn't returned, she said they became very worried and went out to look for Muff and Mac as soon as it was light. But all they found was the Grahams' overturned Zodiac washed up on shore and a can full of gasoline. They turned the inflated boat over and started the motor. Then she said they spent the next 2 days searching for the Grahams or any sign of what might have happened to them. But they found nothing. The Grahams had simply vanished. Shishido found her story implausible.
Thing together, and we went over there.
When she explained how they had taken possession of the Seawind, her story was quite different from the one she had just told Leonard.
No one would have believed us. They would have taken
This
the
time,
boat.
she said they had left Palmyra aboard the Seawind towing the Iola, which got caught up on a reef and sank.
And all we found
Stephanie
the
was tripping
rumors
over her first lie.
And
But I knew there were at least, two conflicting stories as to how they got in possession of the boat. At this point, we became very worried about the Graham's condition. We didn't know what had happened to them, and we certainly was not going to get any real true information from Stephanie Stearns.
but
The FBI has jurisdiction over crime on the high seas. Shishido determined he had enough evidence to arrest Stephanie Stearns for interstate transportation of stolen property. Then his attention turned to Stephanie's boyfriend, Roy Allen, who had evaded the police at the marina and was still at large. Shishido checked, and there was no record of a Roy Allen, but he had the wallet with Roy Allen's picture. Bernard Leonard also told Shishido that Roy had taken marijuana plants to Palmyra and had intended to grow them to sell. Drugs and a photograph of Roy gave him a starting place.
But I suspected that people with, traveling on the Iola, which is not really a seaworthy boat, going around and planting marijuana on the islands and so on, must be involved in drug running.
Hi, Cal. How are you?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. What can I do for you today?
Shishido took the photograph to the Drug Enforcement Agency and showed it to several of the agents.
So we would like to get further information on here.
They were
Well, we do have a
surprised when they
file
looked at the
on Buck.
picture.
Let me get into it.
They
look
told him
around,
that it
see
was
what I
Buck
can get.
Walker
That's great.
and that they had been looking for him.
I'll get back to you on that. Have a good day.
Same to you.
All right.
And so we got all the background data on Buck Walker, and that's when our search for Buck Walker began. And that now we're looking for Buck Walker instead of Roy Allen.
Buck Dwayne Walker was a convicted felon and a fugitive. He had been awaiting sentencing on a drug conviction when he and Stephanie fled Hawaii on the Iola headed for Palmyra. As the search for Walker began with a new urgency, Shishido was also concerned about the Grahams. He knew Stephanie was lying and changing details about what had happened on Palmyra. He didn't trust her story about the fate of the Grahams. There was always the possibility that the Grahams were alive and stranded on the island. Shishido made arrangements for himself and some other agents to travel to Palmyra to see if they could find them.
We decided to go to Palmyra to see if maybe the Grahams were stranded there, in need of food, and or they could have been tied up for all we know, and immobile, and their lives were in danger. So we decided to go out there to look around, and we did.
On the island, they found the remains of the camp Buck Walker had abandoned. They took photographs and examined the site thoroughly. A search of the island produced no sign of the Grahams. However, Shishido did make a couple of curious discoveries.
I remember picking up a hatch cover, and of course later it was identified as a hatch cover coming off of the Iola.
The hatch cover was important because no seaman would leave for high waters without his hatch cover. Without it, the boat could take on water, which would cause it to sink. This told Shishido that Roy and Stephanie had intended to scuttle the Iola. Using these clues, Shishido began to develop his theory as to what happened to the Grahams.
My thinking was that they had tied the couple up and put them on the Iola and sank the Iola. And that was the only explanation we had because we couldn't find the Iola, and there was no way the Iola could be in Hawaii because they certainly wouldn't be sailing the Seawind and the Iola by themselves.
Shishido found something at an old Navy warehouse that piqued his interest.
I think one of the things too that I noticed was that in an old workshop or warehouse, there was an old air rescue boat or sea rescue boat, and it had place for 3 containers where they put provisions. And of the 3, 2 receptacle areas were, the cans were missing, and the third was still left there. And of course, now we're looking for 2 people. In my mind, suspiciously thought that these 2 cans, because it was large enough that they could have been, containing the remains of the couple.
Meanwhile, the search for Buck Walker continued. On November 8th, 1974, after spending 10 days hiding out on the lava flows on the big island of Hawaii, Buck resurfaced in a tiny hamlet off the beaten track. He rented a room and went to a restaurant for a drink. At the same moment, across the street, 2 uniformed officers were eating lunch. As they paid the bill, they showed their waitress a picture of Buck Walker. She said he'd just been in the restaurant looking for a drink, and she'd sent him to a bar across the street. The officers spotted him and contacted the FBI. Buck was arrested on a fugitive charge. He was read his rights and handcuffed without a struggle.
FBI, you're under arrest. Put your
Under
hands on
questioning, Buck revealed nothing that could help the investigation. He answered questions with a frank yes or no, or with stone silence. The investigators couldn't find even the slightest piece of information that could help them find the Grahams.
Right on.
While Stephanie was in prison awaiting trial, Shishido found more proof Stephanie and Buck were lying.
While she was at prison, we found out that she had some photographs developed. So when the photographs were developed and brought back to prison, we seized the photographs and examined them. Among the photographs showed that the Seawind, or Stephanie Stearns, was on the Seawind taking a photograph of the Iola under full sail with Buck Walker on board the Iola. So we knew that at one point Stephanie was on the Seawind and Buck Walker by himself on the Iola.
This was different than the stories both Buck and Stephanie told officials. Shishido was convinced that the Grahams had been murdered. But without any bodies and no hard evidence, the U.S. attorney assigned to prosecute the case did not believe they could make a homicide charge stand up in court.
We could, but it's strictly circumstantial, and we might not win the case. And if we lose the case, and later, years later, if the bodies should pop up and we get some real good evidence as to murder on the part of the Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns, he said we couldn't try them again. So I thought, well, that makes a lot of sense.
Buck Walker and Stephanie Stearns were charged with interstate transportation of stolen property. It was an open and shut case. Buck and Stephanie had been caught with possession of the Seawind in Hawaii and had made numerous attempts to change its appearance. Buck had registered it under his name as a homemade boat. Buck and Stephanie were both found guilty. Buck Walker received 10 years for his previous drug conviction and 5 years for theft of the Seawind. Stephanie Stearns received 2 years for her role in the boat theft. But Shishido was still convinced the couple had killed Mac and Muff Graham, and that somewhere on or around Palmyra was the evidence to prove it. He could only hope that someday it might surface, and then he could charge Buck and Stephanie with murder. On January 21st, 1981, a young South African couple, Robert and Sharon Jordan, were visiting Palmyra. Almost 7 years had passed since Mac and Muff Graham disappeared. That afternoon, Sharon went for a walk down the beach and made a startling discovery. Washed up on the shore was an aluminum canister, and beside it, she found human bones and a skull. Around one of the bones was a wristwatch. She had heard the story of Mac and Muff Graham and immediately contacted the Coast Guard. Cal Shishido was catching up on paperwork when he overheard part of a phone conversation.
Human bones? Palmyra?
First he heard the words human bones, and then Palmyra. Where's Palmyra? The agent was new and had never heard of the case. Shishido was on his feet immediately. Who was on the phone, he asked. The agent told him it was the Coast Guard. Shishido quickly took the phone and told the Coast Guard to ask the couple who had discovered the bones to stay on the island and wait for them.
When I first heard that, of course, I was really excited because I thought, whoa, somebody found some bones on Palmyra, and it had to be the Grahams, and I thought, this is it.
Shishido and a team of investigators flew to Palmyra to examine the new findings. If the bones Sharon Jordan found belonged to either one of the Grahams, the FBI might be able to establish the cause of death. Shishido was shown the gruesome discovery: a skull, human bones, a wristwatch, and some wire, all lying next to an open metal box, identical to the kind Shishido noticed in the rescue boats on his previous visit to the island. He speculated that the wire had been wrapped around the case and had somehow come loose. Then when the case came ashore, it had opened and the bones had spilled out. Since a second container had been missing from the Navy rescue boat, Shishido felt the other victim might still be inside. Divers were sent to search the surrounding waters, looking for a container like the one found on the beach. But in the shark-infested waters, the divers found nothing. When Shishido got back to Honolulu, he sent the container, wire, skull, and bones to the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. for examination. The skull belonged to a Caucasian woman in her late 40s or early 50s. Dental records showed that it was Muff Graham's. The skull also had signs of charring around the left eye socket and a hole in the left temple. The FBI concluded that the contour of the hole was consistent with a gunshot wound, but due to the age of the wound, could not say conclusively that it was caused by a bullet. The aluminum box was examined by the FBI Elemental Analysis Unit. They found evidence of charring on the outside of the box. Next, the FBI needed to determine if the skeleton had been in the box. They cut out a rectangular section and subjected it to a battery of tests. The rectangular piece of metal was found to contain traces of human protein, conclusive proof that the box had once held a body.
The FBI did a tremendous job as far as the container was concerned, because they came back with a report that indicated that there were human remains in the container, that the remains had been burned, and that while it was in flame, the container was in about 2 inches of water. And they found traces of human protein, human fabric in the container and everything, to indicate that a human body was disposed of in the container by flame.
As Shishido had suspected, Muff Graham had not simply drowned, she had been murdered. The FBI now believed it had enough evidence to prosecute Buck and Stephanie for the murder of Muff Graham. Having served her jail term for the theft of the Seawind, Stephanie now had a white-collar job in California. She was arrested and taken into custody. Buck Walker was still serving time in prison, or so Shishido thought.
When I sent our agents in the state of Washington a lead to put a detainer on Buck Walker, I found out that he was an escapee. And so I thought, oh no, not again. You know, are we going to have to do this search all over for him? We found that there was only one woman that had visited him, and that she had visited him the day before his escape.
A trace was placed on the woman which led them to her car, parked in a motel in Yuma, Nevada. The FBI was notified and set up a stakeout. When Buck and another man came out of the motel and approached the car, the FBI moved in. He was considered an armed and dangerous fugitive, wanted both for murder and jailbreak. On the front seat of the car, they found barbiturates and several thousands of dollars in cash. Buck Walker was arrested and charged with the murder of Muff Graham. Stephanie Stearns was also arrested and charged with the same crime, though they would be tried separately. Because of the publicity the story had generated in Hawaii, the trials were moved to San Francisco. Both cases were assigned to federal prosecutor Elliot Inoki. The motive for the crime was never in doubt.
The motive was they were without a seaworthy vessel. The only other couple on the island was leaving shortly. They were running out of food, and they didn't know when any other vessel would get there, if at all, because this was becoming the end of the so-called season when you could expect people to visit the island. So you had people running out of food and provisions with an inability to get anywhere.
Inoki knew he could show Buck and Stephanie had opportunity and motive to kill the Grahams. But first he had to prove in court that Muff Graham was murdered. He also needed to completely discredit Buck and Stephanie's story that the Grahams had drowned. As Inoki began constructing his theory of the case, Shishido was busy putting holes in Buck and Stephanie's defense. The FBI had already found evidence of human protein on the sides of the aluminum box. But since the bones were found next to it, Inoki wanted additional proof that the body had actually been in the box. Therefore, ruling out the possibility of Muff drowning as Buck and Stephanie had claimed, he contacted San Francisco's chief medical examiner, Boyd Stevens.
Finding the skeleton together is supportive that Miss Graham was in that box and therefore held together. It's not possible for me to really say that she couldn't have stayed together if she had been out of the box. However, the problems that would be required is that the skeleton has to stay together even after it's disarticulated. And that's an extremely strong argument that could not have occurred if she had died and just been laying on the lagoon bottom. The second is that the skeleton has to come ashore together, and that's just not really possible.
Shishido also decided to test Buck and Stephanie's story that the Grahams' dinghy, the Zodiac, had been found overturned.
Of course, you know, later investigation showed that if the boat had capsized the way they said they found it, the outboard motor would have been inoperable because of the salt water going into the engine itself. And of course, we made a test to find out whether the Zodiac could actually tip over accidentally, and we tried to force it to turn upside down, banging into things with 3 or 4 men sitting on one edge of the boat, and it just wouldn't tip over.
Inoki also asked medical examiner Boyd Stevens to examine Muff Graham's skull in order to corroborate the FBI's findings that Muff had been murdered. Inoki knew that having two highly respected sources would strengthen his case. Stevens found flat abrasions to the skull, consistent with prolonged confinement in a box, such as the aluminum container.
The key issues for us was the flattening of the skull, which represents that it had been placed against a hard, flat surface, primarily across the left side of the face. And what I'm pointing to is the nose, the eye sockets, and what would be the cheek and life, and of course the teeth. One of the things that was evident about the skull of Miss Graham is that this whole area about the face had been planed down so that it was a flat surface. And if you can imagine, if I take this skull and put it across a flat surface, and let's just say this table is coated with sandpaper, and I work it back and forth for a period of time, eventually I would shave it down till it was a flat surface. There was a second plane showing that the skull had changed position and again had been exposed to a flat surface with motion for a long period of time. We used that as an argument that the skull had been within the box and moving. If the body had been buried in the coral sand, then it would not be a change that we would expect to see. And coffin wear is not seen if somebody's buried in dirt or in coral. It's seen if they're in a hard surface container.
There were minimal animal bite marks and insects on the skull, which were consistent with remains that had only been exposed to the surface life for a short period of time, presumably the time after the box had surfaced and opened. But what about the charring on the skull in the metal box? Did this show an attempt to destroy the body?
One of the questions we had been asked is whether we could prove that the skull had been burned with an acetylene torch.
People who were at Palmyra when Buck and Stephanie were there saw Buck with an acetylene torch. The FBI believed this is what caused the burns to the skull. If Inoki could have Stevens corroborate this, he could further implicate Walker.
If a person is exposed to a flame, there may be burning of the outer portions of the skin, but until the water is evaporated, the tissue can't burn. And it takes a heat period to boil the water off or evaporate it before the tissue can actually burn. Acetylene torches, of course, run fairly hot, and they would do that process fairly rapidly.
The marks on the skull clearly showed the use of an extreme source of heat. Further evidence that Muff had been murdered. The forensic evidence overwhelmingly proved that Muff Graham had been murdered. A trial date was set. A trial involving people who live on the high seas presents some unique challenges. The FBI had to subpoena about 40 witnesses and then make sure they were in San Francisco at the time of the trial. Special Agent Hal Marshall was assigned to the case.
I first became involved when I transferred to Honolulu in 1981 from Los Angeles. Witnesses were flying in from all over the world, literally. Sharon Jordan and her husband and 2 children came in twice from South Africa. And one of the hard situations was a lot of these people were boating people who did not keep in touch. Last we heard of some of them, they were in a bay in Hawaii in a boat with no fixed address. So it was a matter of getting them to San Francisco, sometime having to wait 2 or 3 days, sometime postponing it, weather conditions and things like that that required us to be sure they were there when we needed them. And luckily, everybody showed up that needed to show up, and everything went smooth.
There were only 2 possible suspects, and Buck had an extensive criminal record. But did Buck commit the murder alone, or was Stephanie also involved? She was the last person known to have contact with the Grahams on the day she brought them a cake. Elliot Inoki believes Stephanie had one strong advantage on her side.
Well, she had one option. She could blame Walker. And although she didn't directly do that, her attorney certainly did in the way the case was argued and presented. That gave her a very big option that Walker simply did not have, or if he had, it was a much more difficult sell because of the circumstances and the personalities involved. He's the one with the prior record, much bigger than she is. The testimony about him shooting fish with his gun. I mean, he had a lot of things on his side of the ledger that were not on her side of the ledger. One of the other substantial differences is that Stephanie testified in the case. Walker did not, and so she directly refuted any claim of knowledge or involvement in any kind of homicide. But certainly, through her testimony, left a large room for her attorney to argue that Mr. Walker had the opportunity and the means to commit a murder.
A jury found Buck Walker guilty after only a few hours of deliberations, and he received a sentence of life in prison. Stephanie Stearns was defended by famed attorney Vincent Bugliosi, who was convinced of her innocence. She was acquitted of all charges when he convinced a jury that Buck not only acted alone, but sought to conceal the crime from his girlfriend. We may never know what really happened on Palmyra on that day in late August, though the forensic evidence paints a grisly picture.
Well, empirically, I believe that that Miss Graham was killed exactly as the charge was made, and that is that she was shot, that there was an attempt to burn her body, that her extremities were probably fractured to get her into the box, and that she was cast into the ocean and then eventually came adrift. And I think that that probably happened to the husband as well.
Mac Graham's body has never been found, although investigators believe there's a very high likelihood that he's in the other box. Philadelphia, Mississippi, 1964. A sleepy southern town steeped in tradition finds itself targeted for invasion. Across the South, a legacy of racial hatred is about to be challenged, but not without a fight. Before it would end, 3 civil rights workers would vanish, drawing the eyes of the world to the quiet community with their burning secret. Amen!
In the summer of 1964, Mississippi stood at the crossroads of history. It didn't want to be there. It had no choice. For the black population, the sultry air held the fragrant promise of civil rights. For much of the white population, it was to be a summer of heated intolerance. Violence rumbled throughout the South, but it touched down in Philadelphia, Mississippi. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. The disappearance of 3 civil rights workers drew the attention of the nation to this small southern town. Named for the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia was not living up to its namesake. For in it, brotherhood was divided by race, and the city was ruled by men hiding behind hooded sheets. To solve the mystery of the missing workers, the FBI had to infiltrate and expose the Klan's invisible empire.
Mississippi, circa 1960. The people here were like folks anywhere else, proud of their towns, steadfast in their beliefs, and resistant to change. But change was in the wind, and that wind was blowing relentlessly upon them from the north. In the summer of 1964, 1,000 students from northern universities prepared to go to Mississippi to teach Southern blacks about their voting rights as full citizens of this country. President Johnson was to sign the Civil Rights Bill in July. In a naive sense, it was to be the beginning of the end of black oppression. But generations of hatred cannot be diminished by simple legislation. The student action was spearheaded by COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations. It was an umbrella group that united an alphabet soup of organizations intent on winning civil rights for blacks. The mission was called the Summer Project. According to Joe Sullivan, an FBI agent at the time, that's not how the locals referred to it.
It was labeled very quickly by the Mississippians as the summer invasion of Mississippi, which was forthcoming, and they were looking forward to it rather unhappily. So that was the genesis of the problem.
As the invasion grew nearer, citizens steeled themselves against it. By day, life went on as it always had, and people whispered of the unpleasantness to come. But when the night fell, words turned to action, and the Ku Klux Klan, the invisible empire, began to stir. It wouldn't stay invisible for long. Civil rights workers training in Ohio knew their efforts would be countered by violence and terror, but they had no idea how far it would go or how fast it would escalate. For COFO, Mississippi, with its long history of segregation and rabid racial hatred, was the hardest target for change and the biggest prize. Bob Moses was one of the Summer Project organizers.
Mississippi is targeted in every black person's mind as the symbol of racism. And so as we mount our campaign down there, the question is in our minds, well, you can do all you want. You can pass a civil rights bill if you want to, and you can do this and that, but unless you have actual change in Mississippi, it's not going to really get rid of this infection, because Mississippi is the place where they brew it.
6 months before the students were expected in Mississippi, 24-year-old Michael Schwerner moved from New York to Meridian, Mississippi to establish a base of operations. Schwerner had approached Mount Zion Methodist Church in the nearby black community of Longwood for permission to use their space for COFO meetings.
And we have got to stop it now, nip it in the bud. That's what we've got to do.
But it's dangerous, it's dangerous.
The residents of Longwood, who had peacefully coexisted with their white neighbors, found themselves at a crossroads. The church board had to weigh the benefits to the cause of civil rights against concern for their own personal safety. When the meeting was adjourned, they hadn't come to an accord. But the Klan made the decision for them. Several church members, including women, were badly beaten. Later that night, Mount Zion Church was burned to the ground. Though the fire was never investigated by local authorities, the FBI opened a file on the incident.
FBI, ma'am.
They were keeping a record of possible federal law violations which fell under their domain. They knew that once the students arrived, the summer promised to be long and hot.
Just wondering if I could.
The FBI called the file Mississippi Burning, or My Burn. They conducted their own investigation, asking church members what they saw that night.
How did they know that? How did you know that?
Though the Klan members had obscured their faces, witnesses recalled seeing a man in a truck wearing a sheriff's hat, suggesting that local law enforcement was involved. It wasn't surprising. Many in the South resented the federal government's intrusive push for integration. Local law enforcement often worked to maintain the racial status quo.
The mood is defiance of the federal government, so you're going to defy any attempt by the federal government to change this. They're viewed as the enemy, right? So it's not just that black people are the enemy, the federal government is also the enemy.
Jim Ingram, now the commissioner of the Mississippi Department of Public Safety, was an FBI agent in Jackson in the 60s. Back then, it was a thankless job.
But we travel the state. We might be in Natchez, we might be in Philadelphia, we might be in Hattiesburg, working violent crimes committed against citizens of Mississippi. Therefore, we were away from our homes, and we would receive threats. Snakes were placed in mailboxes. There was always that threat, you better lock your car. You never knew what you might find in your automobile when you return. And also you had threats against your person and family.
But despite all attempts at intimidation, the FBI's presence in the state was about to increase more than 100-fold. While setting up their COFO Operations Center in Meridian, Mississippi, Michael Schwerner and his wife Rita were joined by a 20-year-old plasterer named James Cheney.
Good to have you aboard. This is my wife, Rita.
Hi. How are you? Good to have you.
Fine.
Cheney, a Meridian native, knew the culture and political climate of the area.
Sit down right here. Okay, dear.
24-year-old Michael Schwerner, a liberal from the Bronx, had an Ivy League degree in social work. His background couldn't have been more different from Cheney's, but the men were united in their goals.
Very good. Use that.
Schwerner's friends called him Mickey, a name he seldom heard outside the office.
Townspeople, and I'm talking now about the Klansmen in Meridian, called him Goatee. He wore a goatee, and they called him the Devil.
Hi, Miss Peter Bob Moses.
Schwerner and Cheney were later joined by Andrew Goodman, 20, a volunteer from Queens, New York, who had finished his training in Ohio just 1 week earlier.
Yeah, Andrew, just put in that box right there. We'll be just leaving in a second.
While Rita Schwerner returned to New York, the 3 men and other volunteer staff prepared for the first group of 200 civil rights workers from up north. The first wave of the invasion, scheduled to arrive on June 21st, 1964. That morning, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman drove from their base in Meridian to Longwood, 35 miles away, to talk to the Mount Zion Church members about the fire 5 days before. Cheney, who knew the area, would drive. As the vanguard in the march to freedom, the men knew that trouble likely lay ahead. Their ground rules were unambiguous. Stick to the main roads, cooperate with authorities, and never travel at night. They planned to be back that afternoon. Schwerner told his staff to call the COFO office in Jackson if he didn't phone in by 4 p.m. He never made the call. When Mickey Schwerner failed to phone his office at the scheduled time, the FBI was notified. They in turn contacted local authorities to see if anyone had seen Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman.
What? What are you doing, man? You're not counting like that.
Someone had.
Out of the car!
According to Neshoba County Deputy Cecil Price, the trio was returning from Longwood that afternoon when he pulled them over outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi, 38 miles from Meridian. They were brought to the county jail in Philadelphia.
Another one.
Cheney was booked on a speeding charge.
I need to make a phone call.
The others were held in connection with the burning of Mount Zion Church.
What do you know about that? Nothing, sir.
Cheney was locked in a cell designated for black prisoners. Schwerner and Goodman shared a different cell.
All you have to do is make sure that you're polite. Say yes sir, no sir.
They weren't allowed to make a phone call until dinner time, hours after their 4 o'clock call-in time had passed. According to another person sharing the cell, when the jailer's wife told Schwerner he could make a collect call, he declined. No one knows why. Eventually, after Schwerner paid Cheney's $20 bond, Deputy Price released the men.
Hey, you got the keys?
By then, it was 10:30 p.m.
I don't want to come back to Philadelphia again.
What happened next was anyone's guess.
As long as they were missing, you had some hope. If they had turned up in jail and they were still in jail, then you had some hope. The issue was the release at a certain time of night from the jail, and then they're missing again. So that circumstance means the worst.
Agent Sullivan, too, feared the worst. He suspected that the civil rights workers weren't simply released, but more likely handed over to the Klan.
This was a type of crime that I was familiar with. The lockup and then give away the prisoners instead of releasing them. I was familiar with this sort of thing. I was quite sure that this was what was in progress.
The disappearance was chilling news to the student volunteers scheduled to arrive in Mississippi the next day. But people throughout the state had a different read on it.
The Mississippi response, it was, this is a hoax, and these people have really staged this to get national attention, and, they're up hiding someplace in New York or some other place, right? And this is just all a big publicity stunt. That was the official Mississippi response.
There were widespread rumors, and we were told, I think it appeared in the papers too, that these people had set up a scam here and then vanished to Cuba, where they would leave the state of Mississippi embarrassed by what had happened to them.
The investigation began with Deputy Price, the last person to have seen Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. He stuck with his story of releasing them around 10:30 p.m., but he couldn't account for his own whereabouts for about an hour afterward. For Joe Sullivan, dispatched from Memphis to lead the investigation, it was the only clue,
Any idea which direction they were traveling?
and not much of one.
All I know is they got in their car and they headed out of town, just like we told them to.
The sheriff's office was a participant. That I was sure. I didn't have any proof. All I had was a history of having seen this sort of thing before.
Well, we pulled them over the
And
street and we brought them in here.
at that point, I became more selective about who we were telling, what we were doing.
The FBI began a search for any signs of the young men. No one had seen them, or at least they weren't saying so. Then, on June 23rd, 2 days after their disappearance, their station wagon was found. 2 Choctaw Indians from a nearby reservation had come across the smoldering vehicle the following evening. It had been burned to the metal in a swampy area called Bogachita Creek, 50 feet from the highway near Philadelphia. When they learned of its possible significance, they called the FBI. Special Agent Jay Cochran was dispatched from Washington. An expert in firearms and explosives, he'd seen more than his share of civil rights violence. When he arrived at the scene, he wasn't optimistic about what the car would reveal.
In examining the burned out vehicle, we were looking for any evidence of human remains. We were also looking then for any evidence that may have been left behind of any value in determining what happened to the civil rights workers.
The car was too far gone to provide any clues. But nearby, investigators found something more promising. A watch later identified as belonging to Schwerner. and keys to the car. The watch had stopped at 12:45. It took no time at all for the news of the discovery to spread.
The vehicle hadn't been recovered very long before the news was out on the police wires and the press wires and the neighbors' wires and the radio and so on. And we started to run a stadium at Bogchito, and that wasn't easy.
For those so inclined, the discovery of the car only supported the idea of a hoax. But unofficially, investigators' hopes of finding the men alive had faded.
It was obvious from the beginning that we weren't leaving until the bodies were located. Mr. Hoover wouldn't have countenanced that, and for that matter, neither would the general public. We were going to find those bodies if it took forever.
Agent Sullivan contacted Director J. Edgar Hoover to ask for reinforcements.
I told him that I thought I would need at least 25 men in short order, but I thought I would need more pretty promptly if it developed the way I was afraid it would. And he said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to need 100 men." And he said, "There are 100 men coming."
And they're real good guys, all right?
Soon, 100 agents, aided by student volunteers, descended on Philadelphia to search for Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman.
Help you guys come with me and start checking the bushes over here.
It wasn't enough. The men or their bodies could have been anywhere. Against the backdrop of this agonizing mystery, student volunteers stormed the bastions of the Old South, trying to register black voters. Dixie fought back with all it had. As the summer invasion pressed forward, the eyes of the world focused on Mississippi. In Neshoba County, Deputy Price and Sheriff Lawrence Rainey rebuffed the press. They felt the disappearance of the 3 civil rights workers didn't merit the attention it was receiving. And still the search continued. "400 sailors from Meridian Naval Air Station were pressed into duty, working in rotating shifts. Woods were scoured, rivers were dragged. Then the FBI received word that a body of a black man had been pulled from the Mississippi River near Vicksburg. They went to investigate. Though Vicksburg was 140 miles away, it was possible that Cheney's body may have floated downriver. It was the only lead in an otherwise dismal search.
We discovered that that this body was not that of one of the missing civil rights workers. It was determined that he was the victim of a Klan lynching.
It wouldn't be the only false alarm that summer as other lynching victims surfaced. Some had gone unreported, because in some areas, the Klan was the law. Finding the missing civil rights workers was the FBI's first priority, but busting the Klan was the ultimate goal. As the drive for voter registration continued, the hot Mississippi air crackled with hatred. Klan activity intensified. More than 60 black homes, churches, and businesses burned that summer, and that was just the beginning.
I saw the violence, I saw the killing, I saw the people left homeless by fires, I saw churches burned in the middle of the night, I saw lives being lost for no reason whatsoever. by a group that felt they were right.
To break the Klan's hold on the South, President Johnson authorized a new FBI office opened in Jackson, Mississippi, 3 weeks after the men disappeared. According to Agent Ingram, the days of subtlety were done. The FBI was taking off its gloves.
In a matter of a few months, you had almost 300 agents working up and down. From this state runs about 400 miles from the coast up to the border of Tennessee, so we covered every facet of it. 82 counties, we had agents all over the place.
While some agents continued to beat the bushes, others knocked on doors, hoping to find some leads. People were polite, but uncooperative.
White boys and a black boy. Have you seen anybody?
The FBI's tactic was to divide and conquer.
Okay, thank you very much.
Agents would attend Klan rallies, take photographs, copy down license plates until they were asked to leave. By then, they had what they had come for.
Then, the next time we talked with them, they say, I'm not a member of Klan. Well, you were at this Klan meeting. Why were you there? If you're not a member, you're a sympathizer. Do you know these people blew up a church? Do you know these people blew up a school that was trying to desegregate? Is this the way you want to operate? And most would say no. So we found that being at some of the meetings was a deterrent for some. Some would stop coming because they didn't want us to visit them.
Others required more persuasion. Agents were assigned individual Klan members to watch over from a distance. If a bombing or other act of violence occurred, it was the agent's duty to call that Klansman to account for his whereabouts.
Before long, you know, they did not like being summoned out of bed at 3 o'clock in the morning when a crime was committed 4 counties away, but after a while the wives said, hey, I don't want this anymore. My kids do not want it. And so before long you could talk with them and they understood where you were coming from. You got to know each other on a first name basis.
Soon informants started coming forward. Some were housewives with stories to tell. Others were Klan members haunted by conscience who could provide some small piece of information away from the curious eyes of their neighbors. To provide additional incentive, civil rights and religious organizations came up with money to pay informants. The veil of silence began to lift. Some informants hinted that the investigation should begin at the sheriff's office, though Sullivan had already had his eye on Sheriff Rainey and Deputy Price.
Deputy Sheriff Price was a key target in our thinking, as was Rainey, because Price didn't do very much without Rainey's authority. Our problem was to document what he had done, to find somebody who would tell us about it.
An informant suggested talking with a young man named Wilmer Fay Jones. Agents located 19-year-old Jones living in Chicago. He had suddenly moved out of Philadelphia almost 3 weeks before the men disappeared. It wasn't by choice.
I was told in town that this is the place.
He told agents that his troubles began on June 1st when he went to a store in Philadelphia to get his class ring resized.
You guys could fit that for me.
The woman behind the counter was reluctant, but took his ring to fix. Soon after, he was arrested by Sheriff Rainey and Deputy Price. They locked him up for supposedly asking the shop clerk out on a date. He wasn't allowed a phone call. When they finally released him just after midnight, a gang of men were waiting for him. They roughed him up and forced him into a truck.
Get in the car! Get in! Get in!
The vigilantes drove him to a secluded spot. They tried to force him into confessing that he had asked the clerk out.
Better tell us, boy. I don't think nothing.
He swore his innocence. The gang was prepared to kill him on the spot. But then one of the men, who they called the preacher, spared his life. He told Jones to leave town for good or he was a dead man.
You understand me? You understand me? Get out of here. Go.
Jones was on the next bus out of town.
They roughed me up a little and they let me go.
The story Jones told sounded like a plausible M.O. for what could have happened to Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. Only perhaps they weren't lucky enough to have escaped with their lives.
But here now, we have some additional evidence about what happens to people who are in unlawful custody in jailhouses and are going to be disposed of in one way or another. So if it had happened once in Neshoba County, we were sure it could have happened again.
Believing that Jones may hold the key to the location of the civil rights workers' bodies, agents had him take them to the spot where the gang roughed him up. A search of the area turned up nothing. But there was one informant that Sullivan was keeping to himself, slowly cultivating, winning his confidence by degrees.
Sure, your identity will never be revealed.
This informant spoke under terms of total anonymity. His identity is protected even to this day because his life may still be in danger. He's known only as Mr. X. If anyone still considered the disappearance of the three civil rights workers to be a hoax, their opinion would soon change.
They'll kill me if they were found out.
The FBI's star informant was about to emerge. On July 31st, 1964, Mr. X agreed to talk to Agent Sullivan.
After we finished our social chat, I said, "Are you going to be able to tell me anything significant tonight?" And he said, "I think I can tell you where the bodies are buried." And I said, "Tell me where."
Mr. X told Agent Sullivan that Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner were buried in an earthen dam at a place called Old Jolly Farm, owned by the wealthiest man in the county, Olin Burridge. But agents couldn't go there at once. They knew their moves were being scrutinized by the Klan. They didn't want to make it obvious they'd been tipped off to the burial location. A search warrant was issued for Old Jolly Farm. Sullivan sent Agent Cochran and others to the dam site. When they arrived, they realized this was no job for probing rods and shovels. The earthen mound still under construction was 550 feet long, 20 feet high, and 10 feet across at the top. If the bodies were here, they weren't merely dropped into graves. Rather, the dam was built on top of them. Agents wanted to keep the excavation a secret. That would be difficult now. They needed an outside contractor with bulldozers and other heavy earth-moving equipment to extricate the bodies. According to Special Agent Jay Cochran, there were some concerns about the safety of the crew.
It was decided to utilize armed agents in a convoy of these heavy equipment from Jackson to the location where we would begin using the equipment.
On August 4th, the equipment was in place. The contractor was asked to advise them how best to clear away the earth layer by layer.
Cochran talked to him and said, "Can you give me an estimate as to what the construction cycle was on this dam? How it was built, how the dig was done, how the dam mound was shaped, and in what time sequence?"
He said, well, you must know what you're looking for, and I just didn't comment to him. At no time during these negotiations had either the construction crew or in this case the foreman been told precisely what we were looking for, but I think they would have had to have been blithering idiots, and they weren't, to have not known what we were after.
After the foreman gave agents a crash course in dam building, Cochran poked a stick in the ground where he wanted the digging to begin. Then, in a move that has become a legend in the annals of the FBI, he had a change of heart.
Cochran then picked up a stick, and for reasons best known to his guardian angel, he walked 15 feet further and put the stick in the ground and said, dig here. And that's where they were.
The job, beginning at 8:30 in the morning, progressed slowly. By 2:45, the pit was 13 feet deep, and the pungent smell of death was unmistakable. The machines were moved aside in favor of more delicate garden trowels. As the sun beat down, the odor rose up and poisoned the air. Flies swarmed, ushering in the agent's grim success. Just after 3 p.m. at 14 feet, the first body was found. It was Mickey Schwerner, identified by the contents of his wallet. Goodman was uncovered next, followed by Cheney.
It's very hard to describe. You know, it's perhaps the saddest experience that one can have. It's a graphic illustration of man's inhumanity to man. You know, to simply kill these people for no earthly reason, no earthly good reason.
The bodies had been buried more than a month, so it was impossible to immediately determine the cause of death. The coroner was summoned, and with him came Deputy Cecil Price.
I just walked up like it was sheriff's business. Found a body, how about that? It was pretty casual, really.
Price and the coroner lifted the bodies from the pit so they could be moved to the state hospital in Jackson for autopsy.
Cecil Price helped to load all of them. I didn't help to load any of them. I was letting the local authorities who had jurisdiction over the murders do their thing. So we couldn't be accused of confusing or messing up the evidence or anything of that sort.
If the deputy's presence was an example of the criminal returning to the scene of the crime, Agent Cochran saw no sign of guilt.
Every agent that was at the scene, eyes were fixed on Price when he was there. And I noticed not the slightest emotional reaction. And I don't think anybody else did either.
The bodies were autopsied in Jackson. All 3 men had been shot. Schwerner and Goodman were each shot once, Cheney 3 times. A hard, rock-like substance was pried from Goodman's right hand. Whatever happened that night, the substance showed that Goodman's nightmare didn't end with a bullet.
Upon subsequent examination of that substance at the FBI laboratory, it was determined to be clay similar in makeup or consistent with the clay composition of the soil at the dam site. This would tend to suggest that at the time Mr. Goodman was laid in his grave, that he was still alive.
The bullets from the victims were analyzed at the FBI's Firearms Toolmarks Unit. Most of the more than 5,000 weapons here were confiscated over the years from actual crimes. Though its equipment has changed since 1964, the role of the unit remains the same: to match bullets to weapons. Today, the shooting gallery is the domain of Supervisory Special Agent Paul Tangren.
The bullet will pass over defects within the barrel, and those are defects that are specific and unique to that firearm. And that pattern of marks it picks up passing over these defects is like a fingerprint for that gun.
Bullets from a crime are scrutinized side by side. If they were shot from the same gun, the comparison microscope would form a seamless image of the marks on both bullets. Bullets shot from different weapons simply wouldn't match up.
I've got lots of marks and very little agreement, and that is typical of what you would see of two bullets fired from two different guns of the same type.
Using similar techniques, the FBI determined that Cheney was shot with two different .38 caliber weapons. Residue showed that the men were shot at close range. Total cost of the bullets used to kill 3 men, about 25 cents. Suddenly, to the people of Neshoba County, the missing civil rights activists was no longer a hoax or publicity stunt. This was the turning point. Racists drew the line at murdering white people. According to Agent Jim Ingram, the FBI no longer seemed like the bad guy.
Then they realized we're dealing with some very violent people. So the mood changed to our betterment, because we had people that wanted to assist us. Particularly the little town of Philadelphia, Mississippi. It was amazing how many people then said, look, if we have these people among us that would kill, then we need those individuals found and arrested and prosecuted.
I do want to help you.
Meridian Police Sergeant Wallace Miller was one respected Klan member who had seen enough. He wanted out of the Klan, but the FBI convinced him to stay. Now, the FBI had their mold, and the impenetrable walls of the invisible empire had been breached.
And the colors must be driven out of our hearts. And we have to look to the cross. Let it be done. Amen. The next few weeks.
Sergeant Miller proved that he wasn't involved in the murder of the civil rights workers. He helped the FBI by gleaning information about the crime from fellow Klansmen. Others were also coming forward. Nobody knew that anyone else was talking. The information started to flow. From interviews with various informants, the FBI compiled a list of names of Klansmen who may have been involved. The same names kept coming up. Agents learned that the murders were the plan of Sam Bowers, the first Imperial Wizard, or head of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan of Mississippi. His right-hand man was Edgar Killen, known as the Preacher, because he was one. He was also apparently the same preacher that spared the life of Wilmer Fay Jones.
So we had informants that could give us direct information. We had individuals who actually were involved in the shooting that gave us signed confessions.
Confession led to confession. Slowly, a picture of the events that night took shape.
Going down in Louisiana.
Sir, I need to make a phone call.
It was a plan of horrible simplicity. While Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney were in jail, Deputy Price notified Preacher Killen, who rounded up fellow Klansmen. The Klansmen gassed up their cars, loaded their weapons, and waited until the men were released so they could carry out their Imperial Wizard's orders. When the civil rights workers were released at 10:30, the Klan was ready.
Let's head back to Meridian. How they treat you? Okay, but I didn't like it there. Yeah, spooks. Hey, you got the keys? You just drive. I don't want to come back to Philadelphia again. Let's get out of here.
Not far out of Philadelphia, they must have noticed lights in their rearview mirror closing at a fast clip. They sped up to try to outrun them, topping 100 miles per hour. One pursuer's car broke down, but two persisted. Deputy Price's cruiser was one of them. He hit the flashers. Cheney pulled over.
Matter with you, boy?
Deputy Price yanked Cheney from the station wagon.
Out of the car! You shut up, boy! You were doing over 100 miles an hour in my county, boy. Don't make me chase you like that. You see them lights?
Schwerner and Goodman were escorted into the back of the patrol car.
Get out of there! Whoa!
As Cheney started to follow them, Price clubbed him with his blackjack and shoved him into his car.
Get off, boy!
The procession continued down Highway 19, one of the Klansmen driving the station wagon. The murders occurred without fanfare. Schwerner was the first to die. The cars stopped on a dirt road. Schwerner was pulled out of the car, spun around, and shot point blank. Goodman was shot in much the same manner. They saved Cheney for last, shot by two men. The bodies were loaded into their station wagon. They were driven to Old Jolly Farm, where the bulldozer operator waited in the darkness, ready to conceal the evidence under 14 feet of clay. Last, the station wagon was driven to the swamp. Gas was poured over it. A match was struck. On November 25th, the FBI announced it knew who killed the civil rights workers. But murder charges fall under state jurisdiction, not federal. The best the FBI could hope to do was to convict on civil rights violations. They knew that Mississippi would be unlikely to file murder charges. More than 5 months after the murders, 19 men were charged with felony conspiracy to oppress and intimidate the civil rights workers from practicing their constitutional rights. 2 more were charged with having knowledge of the crime. All made bail and were released. A pretrial hearing was set for December 10th.
When you realize the scope of the physical evidence that we were able to capture, the pictures of the dam, the pictures of the bodies, the post-mortems, the burned vehicle, on and on, we just had enormous amounts of physical evidence, circumstantial evidence to document the confessions. So it was a powerful case that we turned over, and we were blessed because we had 2 outstanding prosecutors.
The evidence was, we thought, insurmountable, but we also knew that there were troubled times in Mississippi, that not everyone thought like we did.
The federal government's prosecution went wrong almost from the start. At the hearing, the judge refused to allow signed confessions or written testimony from key witnesses. The government pressed the matter, and on January 11th, a grand jury indicted 18 men, including Sheriff Rainey and Deputy Price. But the charges were knocked down from felony to misdemeanor. The case languished until 1966, when the United States Supreme Court ruled that the felony charges were applicable. Three years after the murders, on October 9, 1967, the trial was held at the federal courthouse in Meridian. For 10 days, the nation awaited the verdict. But none came. The jury was deadlocked.
And immediately, the people there within the courtroom in Meridian, Mississippi, they burst into laughter and joyful hugging each other, saying, "Hey, we've won. It's a hung jury." Well, the judge said, "No, you're going to go back."
And back they went to deliberate further. That next morning, October 20th, 1967, they reached a verdict. Of the 18 men charged, 8 were ultimately found guilty of civil rights violations, including Imperial Wizard Sam Bowers and Deputy Cecil Price. It took more than 3 years for justice to be served, and even then, it was delivered only in half measures. Bowers received the stiffest sentence, just 10 years. Cecil Price received 6. Sheriff Rainey and the preacher were acquitted. None of the men indicted was ever tried by the state for murder. Many of them still live in Mississippi, and though there's talk of reopening the Myburn files, all evidence in the case was destroyed years ago by court order. The hatred that split the nation was not so easily eradicated. According to civil rights activist Bob Moses, what happened in Mississippi marked the beginning of the great changes to come.
What has changed in Mississippi is that before the 60s, Mississippi held itself as a state apart from the rest of the country, a place which was going to defy the country at any odds to maintain what was its racial apartheid. And now it's indistinguishable from the rest of the country. So Mississippi has become like every other state in the country.
Donations helped to rebuild Mount Zion Church. It has become a shrine to the 3 men who came here hoping to make a difference, and who succeeded in ways they could never have anticipated. Nicky Schwerner and Andrew Goodman were buried in New York. James Chaney's grave is in the hills outside of Meridian, where it bears the scars of vandals. Biloxi, Mississippi. A quiet southern town with a burning core of corruption. In 1987, its secret burst violently to the surface, leaving 2 prominent citizens dead and ripping the top off a grand conspiracy.
On Mississippi's Gulf Coast, a judge and his politician wife are murdered in their home. The killer left few clues. It looked like a professional hit, and the investigation led nowhere. But the FBI refused to give up. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Until we could prove that federal laws had been broken, our hands were tied. It would take years to break the conspiracy of silence and reveal the tangled tale of corruption.
Biloxi, Mississippi. Monday, September 14th, 1987. It was a typically warm summer night in this quiet Gulf Coast town. The workday was over, and most residents had retreated to the tranquility of their homes. Like most of their neighbors, State Circuit Court Judge Vincent Sherry and his wife Margaret were unwinding after a long day. Vincent Sherry was a prominent judge in Biloxi. Margaret was making plans to run for mayor. Both were fixtures at Biloxi's social and community functions. They were a happy couple who had raised 3 grown children. Tomorrow they planned to visit their daughter out of state. Their life together seemed ideal. They were just settling in for the night when an unexpected visitor came to the door.
What are you doing here with that? How do you look out?
And brought their perfect world to an end. The Sherrys were supposed to be with their daughter, so no one realized anything was wrong until 2 days later when the judge failed to show up in court on Wednesday, September 16th. Calls to the Sherrys' home went unanswered.
I'm sorry we can't take your call, but leave your message after the beep.
His colleagues at the court phoned Pete Halat, Vincent Sherry's friend and former law partner.
Morning, Pete Halat.
But he hadn't seen or heard from the judge either.
Well, he's supposed to be in court.
When did he leave?
I don't know. No, wait, you let me call him at home and I'll figure out where he is.
After he left a concerned message on the Sherry's answering machine, Halat felt he'd better check on his friend personally.
Oh, I got the machine. Judge, it's Pete. They're looking for you in court. Is everything okay?
On his way out, he asked his junior partner, Charles Legier, to ride with him.
Charlie, hold on, time to settle up. But I need some help, so let's go.
Listen, I'll give you a call back, okay? Yeah, bye-bye.
I figure if we go together, the two of us will fine.
As they drove, Legier tried to make conversation.
Finding out from lawyers of,
Halat seemed distant, perhaps concerned about the judge. Both of the Sherry's cars stood in the driveway.
Well, the car's here.
I don't like it. Well, his car's here. He's supposed to be in court.
Halat asked Legier to go to the house, while he asked a neighbor if she'd seen the couple.
Just go ahead.
Legier rang the doorbell, but no one answered. He saw that the last 2 morning newspapers hadn't been picked up.
Pete Halat. I'm a partner's business.
The neighbor told Halat she hadn't seen the Sherrys for a couple of days, which she thought was odd since both of their cars were in the driveway. When Legier tried the Sherrys' door, he found it unlocked. Something wasn't right.
Hey, Pete! Pete!
That's unusual.
Yeah, I was just knocking on it and the door opened up.
Halat, concerned by the open door, cautiously stepped inside. few steps in, he made the gruesome discovery. Judge Sherry had been gunned down in his own home.
What's wrong?
They called the police. Authorities arrived to find the body of Vincent Sherry at the front of the house. In the back bedroom, they discovered Margaret. Because the couple was so prominent, the murder investigation became top priority. Detectives contacted the FBI's Biloxi field office. Though the FBI would not yet be officially involved, they offered the use of their agents and forensic laboratory. Inside, the police began scouring the crime scene for clues. They conducted blood spatter analysis to determine projectile angles. If they could figure out where the murderer had stood when he fired the shots, they might be able to reconstruct the crime. Inspector Robert Burris, a crime technician with the Biloxi Police Department, helped process the scene. He discovered a possible clue in the den.
There was blood trailing from his feet, actually going down between his legs a little ways, back to where he was laying. There was blood spatter on a double sliding glass door that was right beyond his head. And further examination in this room, I found some small pieces of foam rubber.
Burris didn't see where the foam rubber could have come from.
3 shell casings, want to get those?
A search of the house led him to one conclusion.
Now this foam rubber had to have been brought into the house. We examined every piece of material in this house, in every room of the house, all pillows, mattresses, everything else. There's no foam rubber tore up in this house. It was brought into the house. It does have gunshot residue on it. And basically about the only way it can get there is for a bullet to be fired through it.
For Burris, the significance of the foam rubber was obvious. The killer had used a homemade silencer. Investigators dusted for fingerprints, but found none of any value. They found 9 spent .22 caliber shell casings from a semi-automatic pistol, as well as the bullets used to murder the Sherrys. The position of the shells indicated that the shots had been fired in rapid succession. But most striking was how well the killer had covered his tracks. Nothing at the scene pointed to the killer's identity.
So what do you
He
think?
did his job well, and his mission was clear.
The lack of evidence in this house, such as items stolen, a struggle occurring, the absence of forced entry, no ransacking going on in the house whatsoever. A person came there for one thing, that was to kill the 2 Sherrys.
Special Agent Keith Bell from the Biloxi FBI field office agreed that this was a professional job. The Sherrys had been assassinated.
The crime scene appeared to be very limited as far as evidence remaining, which meant it was well planned, well executed, and professionally done. A small caliber weapon had been used. The foam rubber indicated that perhaps a silencer had also been used, and the Sherrys had been shot in the head, so it seemed to be a very professional job.
A multi-agency task force was assembled with Special Agent Keith Bell among its members. Investigators would spend days processing the crime scene. They grappled with a single question. Why had the Sherrys been murdered?
That was one of the main questions, that being why were both Judge Sherry and Margaret Sherry murdered. because it was fairly obvious that Judge Sherry could have been killed during his morning or afternoon jogs around the neighborhood. So it was a real mystery why Margaret had been killed.
Investigators believed the answer might lie in the controversy over Biloxi's future. Some civic leaders hoped to transform the sleepy southern town on Mississippi's Gulf Coast into a flashy resort where casinos would attract tourist dollars. But with strip clubs already established in town, Margaret Sherry felt Biloxi's small-town charms were threatened. And the casinos would attract a criminal element. As a candidate for mayor, she had made powerful political enemies by trying to keep gambling out. Agent Bell wondered if Margaret was killed to silence her protests.
Margaret had been so outspoken politically in the community. She was known to be anti-gambling. And if elected mayor in 1989, she had planned to close down the remaining strip clubs in Biloxi. So there was always the possibility that she might have been the target, rather than Judge Sherry.
The task force would investigate Margaret's political enemies, but first, they'd question the Sherry's friends and neighbors. Someone in the neighborhood must have seen something. But even people who'd known the Sherrys for years were reluctant to talk, fearing the specter of Biloxi's emerging criminal underworld.
The Sherry murders brought a dark cloud over the city of Biloxi. Many of the citizens in Biloxi were afraid to openly express their opinions. They saw that Margaret Sherry, who had been quite vocal and quite outspoken in political circles, had ended up dead, as had her prominent husband, Judge Sherry. So many citizens after these murders were hesitant even to be interviewed by FBI agents or by local police officers because they basically did not want their names tied into anything to do with this case.
If people wouldn't talk to the authorities, perhaps they would talk to Lynn Sposito, the Sherry's daughter. After being notified of her parents' murders, Lynn rushed to Biloxi from her home in North Carolina. Determined to find justice, she questioned everyone in the neighborhood. One family friend gave her a crucial piece of information. He described a suspicious car and driver in the neighborhood on the night of the murders. She took the lead to the police.
They identified a man who had seen a suspicious Ford Fairmont driving in front of the Sherry home on Monday night, September 14th, 1987.
Investigators tried to determine the identity of the driver based on the witness's description. Their search came up empty. But a few days later, not far from the Sherry's home, investigators found an abandoned car, a Ford Fairmont. A check on the vehicle's identification number showed it had been reported stolen the day before the murders. Police also learned that the tags on the car were not registered to the car. Realizing that this vehicle was probably the killer's getaway car, investigators towed it to a police garage to examine it further. Somewhere in the car, they hoped to find a key to the killer's identity. Less than a week after the brutal murders of Biloxi couple Vince and Margaret Sherry, investigators received their first promising lead. They recovered an abandoned car, matching the one witnesses described seeing the night of the murders. After contacting Agent Keith Bell about the discovery, investigators processed the car for clues. Inspector Robert Burris found something peculiar.
I was processing this vehicle, and one of the things I noted, the dome light had been dismantled and the bulb taken out of it. In other words, if you open the door, you ain't got no light. Both of the sun visors were in the down position. Whether you're riding around daytime or nighttime, you ain't gonna be able to see the people's face in it very well.
Investigators believed more than ever that this was the car used by the Sherry's killer. Anything found inside it was labeled, packaged, and shipped to the FBI labs in Washington, D.C. But FBI lab examiners would find nothing of evidentiary value. After Agent Bell arrived, he examined the license tag more closely. He discovered it had its own story to tell.
It was determined that the tag on the Ford Fairmont had been stolen from an abandoned vehicle in 1984, actually 3 years before these murders occurred. So what it meant was someone had removed the license plate, likely in 1984, had kept the license plate, and then when this major crime in the city of Biloxi was to occur, they pulled it off the shelf, so to speak.
With no other solid evidence, investigators hoped that following the trail of the stolen tag might lead to the killer. It was traced to an apartment complex where the original car had been abandoned 3 years earlier. Investigators contacted the apartment manager, who told them that prior to having the vehicle towed, he called a friend to come and strip it for parts. The manager's friend was a man that agents knew by name and reputation. Biloxi locksmith Lenny Sweatman. He was the last person to be seen near the car. Sweatman belonged to a loosely organized group of criminals the FBI was investigating in connection with another case. The group was known as the Dixie Mafia. FBI agent Keith Bell had connected the car used in the Sherry killings to Lenny Sweatman. Now, Bell wondered if the Dixie Mafia was linked to the Sherry murders. If Sweatman had a part in it, Bell believed that other Dixie Mafia members couldn't be far behind. He began looking into Sweatman's associates.
What that meant to us immediately, those of us familiar with the criminal associations on the coast, was that if Lenny Sweatman was involved in getting the tag for the hit car, then quite likely his close personal friend and longtime associate Mike Gillich, the strip club owner in Biloxi, might also be involved in these murders.
That's all right. Sometimes you know how it is. Thanks. Oh, beer. All right.
Gillich, who owned 3 strip clubs in Biloxi, was well known to local law enforcement. He was currently under investigation by the FBI in connection with a Dixie Mafia operation known as the Lonely Heart Scam.
See, it gets to him.
But Special Agent Bell needed a thread that connected the 2 investigations together. He started by familiarizing himself with the Lonely Heart Scam. It was run out of Angola Prison in Louisiana by a man named Kirksey Nix, the incarcerated kingpin of the Dixie Mafia.
No, the first model.
Nix would run ads in gay magazines, asking for money to help fictional gay men get out of trouble with the law. Through the scam, Nix was hoping to generate enough money to solve his own legal problems. He was serving a life sentence for murder.
From his jail cell at Angola, he coordinated what we've been referring to as the homosexual scam, which generated hundreds of thousands of dollars from individuals around the country, as well as some people in Canada. With this money, he intended to buy his way out, or attempt to buy his way out, of his Louisiana prison sentence.
Believing that they were helping gay men out of trouble, people who read the magazine ads would wire or mail money to a nearby Western Union. Nix would then call his contact on the outside, Mike Gillich.
Yes.
Gillich would then dispatch his bagman to retrieve the money.
Right. See you later.
Gillich made sure that the scam money was distributed to Dixie Mafia members and safely stashed away for Kirksey Nix.
Take care.
In the coming months, investigators developed more evidence in the Lonely Heart scam, but still had no direct link between these conspirators and the Sherry's killers. A year into the investigation, the murder case threatened to stall.
Hi.
Come in.
As the years stretched to 16 months, the Sherry's daughter, Lynn Sposito, grew increasingly frustrated. In January 1989, she hired a private investigator to rev up the inquest into her parents' murder.
He said he could make out the man.
And I'll give him a call, and I'll be on this case this afternoon.
The family had wanted very much to have a quick resolution to the case, but by early 1989, there'd still been no arrest. And of course, at this point, the FBI had not formally entered the case.
Nice to see you. Thank you for seeing
The lack of official FBI involvement hampered Bell's investigation. So when the private investigator paid him a visit, Bell welcomed his assistants, hoping they could share information. The two were old acquaintances from the private investigator's days in law enforcement. Since Agent Bell was unable to act officially, the private investigator would pursue a lead that looked promising. He would interview another Angola inmate. The private investigator and Bell hoped the inmate at Angola could finally link the Lonely Heart scam and the Sherry murders.
He met with all the right people, and because of his knowledge of the Dixie Mafia and from what he had learned from law enforcement authorities on the coast, he did go over to Angola and did talk to the right person over there.
The inmate's name was Bobby Joe Fabian. He was another known member of the Dixie Mafia, doing time for kidnapping and shooting a state trooper. Fabian claimed he had not been involved in the Sherry murders, but he had learned that fellow inmate Kirksey Nix had been. Fabian told the private investigator that Nix had had Judge Sherry killed because Sherry had allegedly stolen money from Nix's Lonely Heart scam. That wasn't all. He said Nix had been told of the theft by none other than Pete Halat, Sherry's former law partner. Halat, the man who had delivered the eulogy at the Sherry's funeral, was now implicated in their murders. Halat officially represented Nix on legal matters, but Fabian said Halat's role in the Lonely Heart scam was criminal, not legal. Halat was one of the people receiving money from Nix for safekeeping through Mike Gillich's bagman.
Don't forget to pick up next week at the other place.
And the ties between the outlaw and the lawyer went deep. Kirksey Nix's girlfriend and accomplice, Lorraine Sharp, worked in Halat's office. Fabian said both Lorraine Sharp and Pete Halat were stashing money from the scam in a safe deposit box for Kirksey Nix. And he said the amount had reached 6 figures. Thanks to Fabian, the link between the murders and the Lonely Heart scam had been made. And not only had Fabian given investigators a possible motive for the killings, he was also able to supply the name of the alleged hitman, an ex-con named John Ransom, who was believed to be living in Georgia. But tracking down Ransom would take time.
Anytime law enforcement people get together and start talking about notorious Dixie Mafia members, John Ransom comes up quite early in the conversation. He's a longtime alleged hitman for the Dixie Mafia.
In August of 1989, 2 years after the Sherry murders, Agent Bell now had enough evidence to warrant a full FBI investigation into the killings. Accompanied by the Sherry's daughter, Lynn Sposito, he approached the United States Attorney and the FBI with a demand to officially open the case.
So with the tying in of the scam to the murders, we knew we had some federal violations involved. We have wire fraud, we had mail fraud, and we perhaps had a hitman traveling from Georgia to Mississippi to kill the Sherrys. It was decided to open an official FBI investigation and join with local authorities in the investigation.
By now, however, suspect Pete Halat, Judge Sherry's former law partner, had been elected mayor of Biloxi. With a key suspect in such a high position, investigators encountered new roadblocks.
It became very difficult for the FBI to share all of its information with the local authorities. We are not saying that the local police were corrupt. What we are saying is that Mayor Halat put his own people in as Director of Public Safety and as Police Chief, so we were somewhat circumspect on what we shared with local authorities during that time period.
In August of 1989, as investigators attempted to unravel the truth about the Sherry's murders, informant Bobby Joe Fabian made a surprise move. He told his story about the Sherry murders to the TV news. Fabian hoped that by bringing attention to himself, Kirksey Nix would be less likely to have him killed for cooperating with authorities. Along with the report, the station broadcast a mugshot of John Ransom, the alleged hitman in the Sherry case. When Charles Legier, Pete Halat's junior partner, saw the photo, it surprised him. He recalled seeing Ransom outside the Sherry Halat law offices a few weeks before the murders. Legier shared his information with the task force. Major Randy Cook of the Harrison County Sheriff's Department took Legier's statement.
Legier said the reason he remembered Ransom was Ransom stepped off of a curve and came up to him and asked him where's Vince Sherry's office at. When Legier was interviewed, he recalled there was something unusual about the way Ransom stepped off of the curve. Ransom had a prosthesis on one leg.
Investigators learned that Ransom was now in a Georgia prison, serving time for another murder. When questioned about the Sherry murders, he refused to cooperate. As Cook further questioned Legier about the day he and Halat had found the bodies, an important detail emerged. Legier remembered that Halat had walked into the Sherry's living room, seen Judge Sherry's body, and said, "Vince and Margaret are dead." Cook relayed this to Agent Bell.
What was interesting was that Margaret's body was in the far back bedroom of the residence, and according to Chuck Legier, Pete Halat did not have time other than to briefly enter the front of the house and would have no way of knowing that Margaret's body was also in the very back bedroom.
In October of 1989, 2 years after the murders, Agent Bell knew Halat was involved, but he still lacked enough evidence for an arrest. Even so, he felt it was time to confront Mayor Halat. It would be a quiet warning, man to man.
And I let Mayor Halat know that I thought his knowledge of the Sherry murders was much greater than what he had shared with law enforcement authorities up to that point, And I recall also telling him that the FBI would continue working on this case until it was totally solved. My recollection is he smiled and did not have much else to say.
As a lawyer, Halat knew Bell would need more concrete evidence in order to secure a conviction. What he likely didn't realize was the depth of Bell's commitment to bring him to justice. Three years had passed since Judge Vincent Sherry and his wife Margaret were murdered in their Biloxi, Mississippi home. FBI Special Agent Keith Bell had connected the killings to members of the Dixie Mafia and to Judge Sherry's friend and one-time law partner, Pete Halat. The alleged triggerman, John Ransom, was refusing to talk. In January of 1990, Agent Bell and Major Randy Cook of the Harrison County Sheriff's Department drove to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary to question another possible accomplice.
This is Special Agent.
A man named Bill Rhodes. Rhodes, a known associate of John Ransom, was willing to cooperate. He told them that in early 1987, Ransom had contacted him about driving the getaway car in a crime to take place in southern Mississippi. Ransom had said a judge would be murdered and that the pay was $10,000.
There were certain promises made to Rhodes by Ransom that I know certain people in Biloxi that if you'll help me on this and you'll have the run of Biloxi anytime you want it.
So in March of 1987, Rhodes went to Biloxi and met with Ransom and a man named Pete. It was Pete who specifically asked Rhodes and Ransom to do the hit. Rhodes said he also met with Mike Gillich, the Biloxi strip club owner, who would supply the money once the hit was done. But 5 months later, before they could do the job, Rhodes was arrested on an unrelated bank robbery charge, and Ransom got cold feet, afraid Rhodes would turn on him. The information helped the case inch forward, but Agent Bell and Officer Cook still felt that Ransom held the missing pieces. Another year would pass without much progress. In late 1990, the investigators went to the Bostick Correctional Institute in Georgia, where Ransom was serving time. Finally, Ransom agreed to talk. He admitted that he delivered a .22 caliber pistol to Lorraine Sharp, Kirksey Nix's girlfriend. But Ransom insisted that he did not do the job. Based on what Ransom said, Lorraine's involvement was starting to look bigger than simply stashing scam money in a safe deposit box.
All finished?
Finished, thank you.
Through his contact with Sharp, Nix learned that the investigation was heating up. He worried that his girlfriend might talk, so he tried to head off the problem by putting out a contract on her life. But in late 1990, Agent Bell arrested her for her participation in the murders, inadvertently saving her from Nix's gunman. During a polygraph test, Sharp denied her involvement in the Lonely Heart scam and the Sherry murders. But the machine called her bluff. When Bell and his team added her statements to their existing stacks of evidence, they were ready to bring indictments against several key players. Mike Gillich, John Ransom, Lorraine Sharp, and Kirksey Nix were charged as conspirators in the Sherry murders. Notably missing from the list was Pete Halat. The case against Halat would have to wait until they had enough evidence for a murder conviction. For now, the FBI would look to convict the others on conspiracy to commit murder.
So many of the questions came up, why didn't y'all indict Pete Halat early on when you indicted everybody else? Well, at the time, we didn't have the hard evidence that you would have to arrest a mayor and prosecute him.
The conspiracy trial produced several key witnesses that would help investigators piece together the complex scheme.
Mr. Gant, you stated that all these people here
Robbie Gant, Gillich's bagman for the Lonely Heart scam, testified for the prosecution. His testimony helped prosecutors link the Sherry murders to the scam. All 4 defendants were found guilty. Nix was given 15 years in addition to the life sentence he was already serving for murder. Gillich also received a 15-year prison term. Ransom got 10 years, and LaRae Sharp 1.
I pay you for it. Get your hands on order in the court.
With these conspirators behind bars and the Lonely Heart scam no longer operational, Bell moved on to his next objective.
We decided not to end the Sherry investigation after the 1991 initial convictions because at that time we had not proven who had actually shot the Sherrys, and also Pete Halat had not been indicted or convicted at that point, and we all felt strongly that Pete Halat had played a major role in the scam and in the murder plot. So we were determined to continue the investigation to see if we could get enough evidence to indict and convict Mr. Halat and the actual shooter.
In late July of 1992, Agent Bell got the break he was looking for. Following the conspiracy trial, Mike Gillich was desperate to find a way out of prison. He contacted one of his associates in Biloxi and asked him to approach Robbie Gant with an offer. Gant told Agent Bell about it.
And the associate had offered Robbie Gant $20,000 if Gant would recant his testimony against Gillich and sign a false affidavit stating that he had been threatened by me to testify against Gillich, to testify falsely against Gillich.
Gant agreed to wear a wire and get the offer from Gillich's accomplice on tape. Gant met with him in Mississippi. This time, Gant's tape was rolling when Gillich's associate reiterated the bribe. Gant accepted as Bell had instructed. Now, Bell had the evidence he needed to turn up the heat on Gillich. Just the man who could tell the story from the inside. By 1993, 6 years after the double murder of Vince and Margaret Sherry, FBI agent Keith Bell had put 4 members of the Dixie Mafia behind bars. But he still had no formal murder convictions against those involved. And Mayor Pete Halat, the suspected mastermind of the case, was still free and running the city of Biloxi. In fact, the year before, Mayor Halat had broken ground on the city's first big casino.
The victory for our town and our people.
The press still hounded Halat about his involvement in the Sherry murders, but he remained adamant about his innocence. Bell continued to work his plan. He used the bribe Robert Gant had recorded on tape to level another charge against Mike Gillich, already in jail. Now Bell indicted Gillich for witness bribery and witness tampering for trying to buy off Gant. And that did the trick.
No doubt the most important turning point was in October of 1993 when Mike Gillich finally decided to cooperate and tell the story of this whole case from an insider's point of view. And that's what really allowed us to bring final resolution to this investigation.
After the years of painstaking work Bell had spent on the case, it was a satisfying moment. Finally, it seemed his patience and ingenuity were paying off. Gillich was in no hurry to accrue more jail time. Bell's relentless pressure had persuaded him to cut a deal before the bribery trial even began. The Dixie Mafia member would tell what he knew about the murders.
Mr. Gillich has...
Maybe now, Bell could get the convictions he knew were long overdue. But for a career criminal like Mike Gillich, adjusting to life on the right side of the law wasn't easy. At first, he tried to bluff his way out.
Of course, it always takes some time, a period of weeks, to develop some degree of trust and to be able to communicate with someone like this who, for the first time, has decided to leave his lifelong role as a criminal and start cooperating with the FBI.
When deception didn't work, Gillich had no alternative. He had to tell the truth. Now, for the first time, Bell heard the story from an inside source. Gillich knew all the details.
Mike was the center point. Mike knew Kirksey Nix. Mike knew Pete Hallett for years. And in fact, when Kirksey Nix was looking for an attorney over in the coast area to represent him on various matters, Mike Gillich introduced Nix into Pete Hallett.
He confirmed that Pete Hallett was indeed behind the plan to murder the Sherrys, and that the plot grew directly out of the Lonely Heart scam of Angola prison inmate Kirksey Nix. Some months before the Sherrys' deaths, Hallett had closed the safe deposit box he and Nix's girlfriend LaRae Sharp had access to, effectively cutting off her access to the money. He then transferred the money into a box only he and Judge Sherry could use. Motivated by greed, he stole $100,000 cash from there. As Nix's trusted accomplice, Hallett could blame the theft on Judge Sherry. Next, he went to Mike Gillich with news of the theft.
Mr. Gillich stated that Pete Hallett approached Mr. Gillich himself in late 1986 and told Mr. Gillich that much of the money was missing, supposedly around $100,000. And Mr. Hallett blamed Judge Sherry for taking the money. Mr. Hallett knew that Kirksey Nix would be very furious about this.
It is not known who ordered Margaret's death, but as a fierce opponent of corruption, she posed a threat to the underworld forces hoping to control Biloxi. With Margaret dead, Hallett could be free to run the town. Gillich said that he and Hallett planned the murders. Ransom and Rhodes provided the murder weapon. But when they passed on doing the hit, Gillich found a replacement. A Texas-based petty criminal named Thomas Holcomb. Holcomb would be paid $20,000 to murder Judge Sherry and his wife. Gillich had also helped provide the car with the help of locksmith Lenny Sweatman. In October of 1996, agents arrested hitman Thomas Holcomb in Texas on murder charges. That same month also saw the arrest that Agent Bell had anticipated and worked 9 years to achieve.
I'm an innocent man, and you're going to put the cuffs on me?
Let me read you your rights.
The arrest of Pete Halat for the murders of the Sherrys.
You can, anything you say can and will be held against you.
Kirksey Nix and LaRae Sharp were indicted on 52 counts, including fraud, money laundering, and murder. Halat was tried and convicted in the summer of 1997, a full decade after the crimes were committed. He was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Also tried and convicted were Kirksey Nix and Thomas Holcomb, the hitman. Both were sentenced to life. LaRae Sharp, Nix's girlfriend, got 5 years.
I think a lot of citizens in Biloxi now realize that there are a lot of dedicated professional law enforcement people who will do everything they can to protect the community and work hard to solve major crimes. Perhaps the legacy, you might say, of the case for the criminal element is that they realize after seeing this case that they can commit a crime one day and think they're getting away with it a year later, but it could come back 10 years later and get them.
While the Sherry's killers were finally brought to justice, Margaret Sherry's dream of a Biloxi free of gambling was never realized. Instead, Biloxi has become a resort town filled with casinos and neon lights. The sleepy southern town is gone forever, along with the woman who lost her life trying to save it.